Tactical RPGs, sharing the same roots as normal RPGs, they've been around for quite some time, only really being established and popularized with the inception of Fire Emblem, a series that take the best elements from previous entries in the fledgling genre and make them its own, including genre staples like permadeath and unique units, only motivating the player further to win battles without losing them. However, while Fire Emblem would establish the genre's core concepts, it only really established them in Japan, as the series wouldn't see a worldwide release for some time. Instead, it'd only be in the late 90s that the genre would finally be widely popularized in the West, with the release of a little game called Final Fantasy Tactics. Hello everyone, this is the RPG Monger, and after spending a bit too much time away from YouTube, I'm back and ready to tackle the tactics games. By the mid-90s, Square had become the company for solid RPGs, creating not only the prolific Final Fantasy, but other separate RPG hits as well. So as the company's shining jewel, Final Fantasy, kept becoming more successful with the recent Final Fantasy VI, the company made sure to take full advantage of its ever-growing spotlight and release more games with the Final Fantasy name slapped on. And what better way to do it than tackle other sides of the RPG spectrum that the mainline games can't reach? In turn, while the core team at Square focused on Final Fantasy VII, two spin-off games would enter development alongside. Chocobo's Mystery Dungeon, a game that added Final Fantasy to Chunsoft's Mystery Dungeon formula, and Final Fantasy Tactics, a game that allows Square to take a sizable slice out of the ever-growing tactical RPG genre. Though who would create Final Fantasy Tactics? Well, while this wouldn't be the first time Square dabbled in tactical RPGs, this was the first time they were associating one with their main series, meaning it absolutely had to be great. Good news though, with Square only increasing in notoriety and power, they now had quite the selection of people to choose for the task, not limited to just those within the company. Enter Yasumi Matsuno. Joining the gaming industry in the early 90s with Quest Corporation, he had gone on to immediately make a name for himself in the tactical RPG genre with the Ogre Battle series. Games that, while aren't the most well known in the West, were quite influential for the genre in Japan. Clearly the man had talent when it came to making tactical RPGs, and Square recognized this all too well, as when it came time to make Final Fantasy Tactics, not only would they acquire him, but a good chunk of his development team from Quest too. And thus, 2 years after leaving Quest, Final Fantasy Tactics was born, luckily coming out at a time when Final Fantasy was experiencing popularity like never before with the unprecedented success of Final Fantasy VII. Though what did Tactics end up becoming? Well, at its core, as you'd expect with the development team mostly consisting of those who worked on the Ogre Battle games, Tactics was essentially a Final Fantasy to Tactics Ogre, the second game in the Ogre Battle series. As when comparing Final Fantasy Tactics and Tactics Ogre, both games used an isometric grid for combat, and turns for each character in battle worked pretty much the same. But thankfully, Final Fantasy Tactics wasn't just a reskinned Tactics Ogre. Instead, making use of the franchise they were given, Matsuno and his team combined the base gameplay of Tactics Ogre with the Final Fantasy job system, mostly the version of it in 5. And let me tell you, they couldn't have made a better decision. I mean, in all honesty, while the job system adds a good bit of spice to the standard turn-based system older Final Fantasies have, applying it in a strategy game like this changes up everything. Because now, instead of just being confined to one class per character, the job system allows you to mix stuff up, combining abilities from multiple jobs to create all sorts of crazy setups. Hell, when I was going through Tactics myself, the time I spent in menus planning what characters would learn what abilities from which jobs rivaled the time I spent in the battles themselves. Plus, what with the game only giving you a couple base jobs to start with, unlocking more and more as you level characters through different jobs, it forms a solid gameplay loop. And believe me, it's more than key that you strategize which characters do what, because when it comes to difficulty, Tactics wastes no time whatsoever introducing sizable difficulty spikes throughout the game, at least until you gain the option to use a certain character. And on a side note, if you haven't gone through the game yet, whatever you do, don't be an idiot like me and save in between chains of battles. It's the easiest way to completely softlock your file. Trust me, I speak from experience. But that aside, stellar gameplay wouldn't be the only thing Tactics brought to the table, as living up to the Final Fantasy name, the game would also bring with it an incredible story distinct from the stories told in the mainline games, all thanks to Matsuno. You see, before he even started making games at all, Matsuno studied foreign policy and politics, with his interests in the subject dating back even further, granting his writing style a unique perspective he made full use of. I mean, just take Tactics. While on the surface, its plot revolves around the protagonist Ramza going around Ivalice trying to collect the Zodiac Stones, once you actually go through the game, it's so much more, with the plot dealing with topics ranging from class struggles to mass conspiracy. To do it justice, I'd have to spend an entire video explaining it, as just like how Matsuno based Tactics Ogre on the Yugoslav wars of the 90s, Final Fantasy Tactics would end up being inspired by the Wars of the Roses in the 15th century, with the civil wars in Ivalice directly paralleling the aforementioned struggles for the English throne fought between two major factions. And on another side note, aside from the Wars of the Roses, the story of Tactics was also inspired by the state of Square at the time, with Matsuno noting how some figures within the company were treated like royalty due to their past accomplishments, causing him to be doubtful about whether someone who was new like him could even succeed in such an environment. But aside from how the main story is told, Tactics has this neat little way of packing in extra story throughout with the rumor system. Basically, as you progress in the game, you can check up on the rumors being spread throughout pubs to learn extra exposition and tidbits about what's happening in Ivalice alongside the main story. Sometimes they're just updates on what's happening to certain characters, but other times they're full-on paragraphs updating you on the state of the war and its factions, really making you feel like you're in the thick of it all, watching it shake up the lives of everyone in Ivalice. And story content aside, Tactics would also have side content ranging from dispatch quests, small missions you could send party members on for free ability points, to side quests that unlock various things ranging from items to new characters. One of those said characters being none other than Cloud Strife, because why not? I mean, if you're gonna make a game tied to Final Fantasy, you may as well make the most of it. All in all, the tale of Ramza and Delita starting off as childhood friends oblivious to the evils of the world, only to then become thrust into full-on war as they each pursue their own path to set things right, is really something else, and I'd recommend anyone watching right now who's never played it to give it a chance. Though on that note, if you do have a choice in the matter, I'd recommend the PSP remake of the game over the PS1 original, since alongside just adding a sizable chunk of new content like new jobs, new quests, and even animated cutscenes, the original version of Tactics did come with a few issues, mainly revolving around its spotty localization, something that at the time wasn't a very uncommon issue. So if you get the chance, play it. But anyways, moving on from that, once Tactics was out, it was clear to Square that Matsuno lived up to its reputation, the game selling nearly 1.24 million copies within a year in Japan alone. In turn, Square would put his talent to use, granting him and his team free reign to work on a new game, this time not attached to the Final Fantasy franchise, called Vagrant Story, an action RPG that, despite coming out around two other massive Square games, Final Fantasy IX and Chrono Cross, still managed to stand on its own, accruing a decent amount of attention and praise, being the only PlayStation game ever to receive a perfect 40 from Famitsu. Though what does this have to do with Tactics? Well, nothing, at least not yet. You see, in Vagrant Story, Matsuno decided to include minor Easter eggs referencing Tactics and Ivalice just as a little fan service for those who'd played his previous game. But whether he knew it or not at the time, Square would soon have other ideas for his creations. Though let's not get ahead of ourselves just yet. Going past Vagrant Story, Matsuno would only get busier, as with him becoming a larger figure within Square, the projects he'd be given would be equal in burden, namely his very own numbered Final Fantasy XII, a game that instead of taking the route Vagrant Story did of solely including minor references to Tactics, would straight up take place in Ivalice, its story set in a different time period than the events of Tactics. However, speaking of Tactics, it would soon become pretty relevant again, as after talks between Square and Nintendo reached their conclusion, work began on the next entry in the series, Final Fantasy Tactics Advance. Now, when it came to the development of Advance, things were a bit unique. You see, directly before development started, Square had actually gone ahead and bought out Quest Corporation, reuniting those who'd left with Matsuno with their former co-workers, as a result creating the perfect dev team for Advance. But on the flip side, Matsuno wouldn't be helming this one like he had with the first entry, instead taking on the role of producer and overseeing the project while developing 12. Thankfully though, even with Matsuno being less involved with the game, game, Advance would end up surprisingly good, the strengths of the dev team shining clearly in the final product. You see, just like the original, Advance would once again combine the job system from Final Fantasy with the way battles worked in Tactics Ogre, except this time around they decide to add an entirely new system into the mix: laws. Basically, how they'd work is now alongside the units of your team and the enemy team, there'd be a neutral unit called a judge, who at the start of every battle assigns a law, sometimes multiple depending on how far you are into the game. And like you'd expect a law to do, they mandate what you are and aren't allowed to do in that specific battle. Here's an example. Say the law says that fire magic is banned from that fight. Well, that means if you go ahead and use fire magic regardless, you'll get penalized with either a yellow or red card. If the action didn't defeat the opponent, it's a yellow card, resulting in a penalty once you win the fight. But if the action did defeat the opponent, you'll get a red card, sending the character that performed the action to jail, removing them permanently from the fight. But laws aren't only there to restrict you, since accompanying every law is a recommended action, which if you use in battle will award that character a judge point, spendable towards using combo attacks or summoning an extremely powerful monster to attack every enemy. In terms of changing up the tactics formula, laws are pretty ingenious, forcing you to approach battles differently depending on the laws they have. And if said laws are too much, then you can use your anti-laws, cards you collect past a point in the game that can add or remove certain laws you'd rather not have in battle. Plus, laws aside, Tactics Advance would also change up the job system, with abilities now being learned from gear rather than using ability points to unlock them. A progression system that honestly grew on me pretty quick, especially when you find a powerful weapon with an insane ability attached to it. But above all, probably the biggest change to the job system was adding separate races into the mix. Since whereas in the original Tactics, any character could learn any job, granted they had the prerequisites for it, in Advance, a good majority of jobs are only accessible to the race that can learn them, with there being 5 races in total: Humes, Moogles, Vieira, Numo, and Bonga. In my opinion, it adds an extra level of strategy to it all, with me, just like in the first game, spending a lot of time in menus just deciding what types of characters I wanted on my team. Not to mention, going back to general gameplay, while Advance would still sometimes feel slightly grindy, it was nowhere near the level of just grinding through random encounters in Tactics. Now, the game had fully fledged side content, and a lot of it too, with a steady flow of side quests and the whole system surrounding the conquest of map locations, making the grind for levels and abilities far more enjoyable than the game's predecessor. However, there's one major factor we still haven't touched on yet. How was the game's story? Well, coming off of the first Tactics, a grand tale about manipulation and war, Tactics Advance was an isekai. Yes, I'm not joking. But hold on a second, before any of you out there make hasty judgment, believe it or not, it's actually one of the best interpretations I've seen of the genre yet. Without divulging too much, Tactics Advance starts out straight up in the real world, with our main characters being kids who are fans of, wait for it, none other than the hit video game Final Fantasy. Interesting start, I know, but the thing is, before the kids get whisked away to the fantastical world of Ivalice, it's alluded to and set up that each of them have pretty real problems bearing down on their lives. Like Mute, for example. Before being put into Ivalice, he was a regular victim of bullying, all the while having to put up with his dad, who after his mom died had become a useless drunk. Or the protagonist's brother Doned, who due to suffering from a condition is bound to a wheelchair. So once they all find themselves in Ivalice, they're free to do whatever they want, no longer bound by their real world problems. So as the main character Marsh realizes this, he takes it upon himself to make his friends and brother realize that at the end of the day, all they're doing is running away from their problems rather than facing them head on and progressing through life. If anything, I'd call the game an anti-isekai isekai. Ultimately, taking it all into consideration, Final Fantasy Tactics Advance was a fantastic game, especially for the Game Boy Advance. I mean, hell, for that handheld, some of the animations in the game caught me by surprise. And even with Matsuno only filling the role of producer, I feel the game lived up to the reputation of its predecessor, taking a fresh new approach to the Tactics formula. Though don't take it from me, aside from just in general being a pretty successful Game Boy Advance game, Advance would go on to receive quite a few accolades, being the 40th highest selling GBA game for 6 years. In fact, if any of you out there still have a Wii U, or what I like to call it, the Virtual Console machine, you can still get Tactics Advance on it today, so do give it a shot. Though moving on from Tactics Advance, now we enter Stormy Seas. To start things off, disaster would strike in Matsuno's life, as during the development of Final Fantasy XII, he would flat out lose a chunk of his development team, since with Hironobu Sakaguchi splitting off from the now Square Enix to make his own company, he'd take a good bit of the people in Square with him. As a result, due to the combination of frustration with the company and the ever-growing stresses of developing 12, Matsuno would bow out of development entirely and leave Square Enix citing health issues. However, even with Matsuno gone, Square Enix still owned all of the properties he'd ever made, and thus, whether they had his cooperation or not, they'd continue being made, Tactics included. But before we talk about the third entry in the series, there's something else I have to touch on, as it'd pretty much go hand in hand with anything remotely related to Ivalice post-12. Square Enix's Ivalice Alliance. You see, starting in the mid-2000s, Square Enix began taking steps towards making miniseries out of their successful games, the compilation of Final Fantasy VII being one such miniseries. If you're interested in knowing more, I'd suggest checking out my other video on the topic and Final Fantasy in general, but back to the matter at hand, the Ivalice Alliance would be one such miniseries. Now, whereas the games were more or less separate before, every game with Ivalice in it would be retconned into the Alliance, including games like Vagrant Story, with 12 referencing it a good bit. As far as Square Enix's miniseries went, the Ivalice Alliance's main priority was to attract more players to the games within the series, since they were now all apparently linked. But what was not put into thought was the said linking, because this stuff is all over the place. I mean, for starters, Tactics and Vagrant Story were made years before the Alliance was remotely thought up, so slapping them into a continuity like this is patchy at best. Though even then, after going through the entire timeline myself, it's admittedly pretty entertaining just seeing how in the hell they somehow crammed all these games into a single timeline. For one, their big explanation for why only humans exist in the first Tactics and Vagrant Story was due to a supposed catastrophe far before the games that killed off all other races, including Moogles. Oh, the absolute tragedy. But enough of that. We're here to talk about Tactics, and that's what we're gonna do, because starting in 2006, development for a third Tactics game would commence. Originally slated for the Game Boy Advance again, the game would soon shift to the new Nintendo DS, a handheld that swept the globe in no time flat. In fact, part of the reason a third Tactics game even happened was due to demand, with Square Enix being well aware of how much fans wanted more Tactics. So after a year's worth of work, Final Fantasy Tactics A2 would release, a direct sequel to Advance. The question is, what with Matsuno having nothing to do with the game, would it still live up to the standards set by the first two? Well, kind of. Starting with the good, let's talk gameplay, because whereas Matsuno wasn't involved with the game, many people from the dev teams of the first two were, and they seriously improved things. Like, I wouldn't say it's a stretch that out of the three games, A2 has some of the best gameplay, with a gameplay loop I never got tired of. Though let's take things one at a time here. In terms of things they kept from Advance, the law system makes a return in A2, but not in the same capacity. Instead of being the main mechanic the game revolved around, laws are now a bit less important, with fights only having a singular law all the way through the game. Now, in Advance, breaking laws would have serious repercussions in the form of yellow or red cards, but now all breaking a law does is remove your judge's protection, preventing defeated characters from being revived. And on the flip side, the results of abiding by laws would be altered as well, with judge points being replaced by rewards at the end of the match, and a boost of your choice throughout the fight should you uphold the law. But what wouldn't be reduced was the job system, because oh boy, did they add stuff. Not only would A2 bring back all jobs from Advance, they'd add on to them, giving each race new jobs and creating two new races entirely, each with their own exclusive jobs. The team comp possibilities alone were nuts. And touching on side content, while all Advance did was add more side missions to accompany the dispatch ones, in A2 you're now given the option to do every mission yourself, including those that you could just dispatch, which I personally really liked, since just in general, side content in A2 had a whole lot more personality than the side content in Advance. Just take Advance's mechanic of conquering areas. In A2, they turned the cool mechanic into a fun minigame where you participate in an auction against other clans. However, going back to that aforementioned gameplay loop, let me talk about my personal favorite feature, the Bazaar. You see, in Advance, you kind of had to rely on side missions to get you the weapons you wanted. Now, every mission, side quest or not, gives you materials rather than weapons or armor. Then, with said materials, once you take them to the Bazaar, you can align different ones to unlock new gear. A process that's really quite simple, but really addicting the more you do it. If anything, I honestly had more fun doing that than I did with the main story itself. And on that note, let's talk about the story. Once again, like Advance, A2 was also an isekai, but unfortunately a far worse one than its predecessor. Unlike Advance, where the main conflicts are pretty well ingrained in real life, all the while still being accessible to the younger audience who owned Game Boy Advances, A2 took the lazier route, with Luso, the protagonist's main conflict being that he wants to get out of school for summer break and doesn't want to be chewed out by his aunt. That's it. Aside from that, the story is just generic fantasy fare, mainly circling around the MacGuffin of the game, the Grimoire of the Rift. Not at all comparable to how Advance treats things. Honestly, the most interesting things that happen during the course of the main story is the fact that Vaughn and Penello from 12 show up as participating characters and 2 surprise characters that make a return from Advance. Seriously, that's all I can really come up with. Like, if they ever manage to just take all the gameplay mechanics from A2 and mash them up with Matsuno's stellar storytelling, you'd end up with a masterpiece of a game. And well, that's that with A2. It somehow managed to pair my favorite gameplay mechanics utilized in the series yet with the worst story yet. What a combination. Though hey, no series is perfect, there will always be games with more flaws than others, so let's move on. What would Square Enix have in store for Tactics yet? Well, to the dismay of everyone, essentially nothing. I mean, what with Square Enix entering its largest company-wide crisis with the labor development of Final Fantasy XV, coupled with Final Fantasy XIV's initial catastrophic launch, coupled with the general receptions of games waning overall, Tactics would kind of slip through the cracks, only receiving one more game I'm sure the majority of you don't even know existed. Final Fantasy Tactics S, a mobile game that would only survive a year before it too went offline. But I haven't lost hope. While we haven't heard anything about a new entry to the series in years, Square hasn't exactly forgotten about it either. Just take the aforementioned Final Fantasy XIV. In its second expansion, Stormblood, the Alliance Raid series was focused entirely on Ivalice, containing loads of references to Tactics and 12. Hell, even Matsuno himself was involved, returning to write the story as a freelancer, showing that whatever qualms he may have had with the company have since healed. In fact, soon after I put this video out, 14 is gonna get even more content related to those raids, so clearly they haven't forgotten. Plus, back in late 2018, when I made a video similar to this talking about how the Pokemon Mystery Dungeon series had waned, now in 2020, it's been revived with a stellar remake, so who knows what may happen with Tactics in the future. In the end, with Square Enix seemingly on a continuous rise, we can only hope that this legendary series doesn't fade away into just a myth. Well, it's that time again. Before I head on to the outro, let me give an update to all of you who've been waiting for a new video. I know, it's really been a while. To put it simply, this past year has been extremely hectic for me, both in my personal life and not, and the way things are heading with me planning a big move this year, that trend isn't showing any signs of stopping. But unlike before, this time I'm back for real, with multiple videos in the making while I finish this one. Plus, as most of you have likely noticed, my channel art has changed. I highly recommend you check them out, as they've helped me out a great deal. And if you want to see more of me outside of me babbling about stuff I'm interested in, I still have a Twitter account, and more recently, I stream weekly again on Twitch. So do check me out there if you can. Seriously though, for those who've stuck with me even through the multiple droughts of videos, I'm more grateful than you'll ever know. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more like it, do subscribe, and today's cool thing of the day is Pokemon Mystery Dungeon Rescue Team DX. I mean, come on, you thought I wasn't gonna talk about it in a video? Just to say a few words, since I don't want to take up too much more of your time, absolutely check out this remake if you're a fan of the series. They honestly could not have done any better with it, from the art style to the gameplay. Plus, the music remixes could not be any better, trust me. And hey, if you've never played any of the games in the series, this would be a great entry point. So that being said, I'm the RPG Monger, and don't forget that each and every one of you are fantastic.
My name is Marche.